In the previous video, we had seen the use of volume with a MongoDB database in order to persist the data in our database. Let's examine a little more about volumes. In Docker, there are two ways of managing data, especially persisting data. The reason for that, we need to understand how a Docker container deals with files that exist in the Docker container. Now, as you can see in the document behind me, all files created in a container are stored in a writable container layer. And also, one of the important things to note is that the data doesn't persist when the container no longer exists. That is an important point to note about the use of files within a container. Now, if you want to persist the data even after the container stops, then in Docker you have two options: either to use a volume or to use bind mounts. We will examine bind mounts in more detail in a later video. In this video, we will look more specifically at volumes and how we can make use of it. So these are the two options. Now, if you are running Docker on a Linux machine, you can use a temporary file system mount which is mapped into memory. We are not going to deal with that right now. We'll defer that to later. Similarly, if you're running Docker on Windows, you can use something called a named pipe. Even that, I'm going to defer that to a later stage in there. Now, so what we have understood so far is that volumes and bind mounts are two ways of persisting data in a Docker container. As I said, bind mounts will come to that later. So volumes we'll look at in more detail. So let's go ahead and then look at the documentation for volumes. So to use a volume, as we see here, volumes are the preferred method of persisting data generated and used by Docker containers. Now, volumes are completely managed by Docker, and it stores it at a location that is known to the Docker daemon, and you will not explicitly be able to see, although we can actually see where it is stored on the host computer. But that is one way of persisting data. Here are some points about why you would consider using volumes in your application. Typically, the way the volume works is as follows. So if you have a container, you will have a volume map the contents into a particular Docker area within your host's file system. The host is where you're running your Docker daemon and then running the container there. So in the host file system, so you're going to make the files use of the file system in your computer, but in a specific location that is completely managed by the Docker daemon. Volumes are mapped into there. Now, in the previous video, I had shown you the location of a folder where it is mapped on my Mac. On a Windows machine, it is mapped
It's
to a specific
12:30.
folder on your Windows machine. We don't need to worry about where exactly it is. All that we need to understand is that there is a special area within your host file system which is used by Docker to store the volumes there. And also, when you use the volumes, you use the -v or the --mount flag or the option when you run the Docker run command. I have illustrated both the use of the -v as well as the --mount option in the previous video. The details of how you supply the parameters for the minus V option or the minus minus volume option or the minus mount option are given in this document here, a link to which I have provided in the description of this video. You can read more about this there. Now, if you use the minus V or the minus volume option, you specify 3 fields separated by colon characters. So the fields must be in the correct order, and the meaning of the field is very obvious from the way you specify it. You can also specify the volume to be read-only. We will look at that at a later stage, but right now for a database you can't use a read-only volume because you want to be able to modify the contents of your database and persist that in the volume. At a later stage, we will see the use of a read-only volume in more detail and how we can specify that. If you use the minus minus mount option, this is the preferred way of specifying it in the newer versions of Docker. And this minus minus mount makes it explicit on what exactly you are doing there. And in this case, you need to supply the type, which can be either a bind, a volume, or TMPFS, temporary file system. So in our case, we are making use of the volume. So we specify type equal to volume, as I did in the example there. The second part is the source of the mount. So the source in case of a volume specifies the volume name, which I had given in the previous video. The destination, the folder to which, or the directory in the Docker container to which this volume should be mapped, is specified by specifying the path to that particular directory as the destination. It can be specified as destination, DST, or target, whichever one that you can use there. And typically, as I said, you specify the mount using an option like this. So you can see that there are a lot of options that you can specify there. You can say type, volume, source, or SRC. You specify the volume name, DST or target or destination. You specify the container path in the Docker container where this volume needs to be mapped. This has to be enclosed in single quotes, as you can see here. That is how you supply the mount option to mount a volume. Now you can read more details about volumes and mounts in this document, and I will refer to those as and when we require. But right now, all that I want you to understand is how to make use of a volume in a Docker container.